Turning Point is a production of KTCA, Channel 2.
Tonight from Turning Point.
This is the police.
Okay, what I want is a battered woman.
You are a battered woman?
Yes.
Who assaulted you?
My ex. He's in the house and I'm scared.
Is he in the house?
Yes, and I'm scared.
It's a frying pan. Then he threw at me. And I'll show you the nightgown that I have that's got full of blood on.
David, you're under arrest for domestic violence.
Domestic violence, spouse abuse, wife battering. No matter what you call it, the crime is a serious one. Tonight, in a special 90-minute Turning Point, we'll look at domestic violence. And insurance-related products and services to individuals and businesses since 1853.
Good evening. I'm Dave Iverson. It is tempting to begin a program like this one with a long list of startling statistics, numbers that document victims and offenders in great detail. But this time, we will give you only one fact, one number. Studies now show that anywhere from a third to better than a half of all married women are subjected to physical violence. It is an all-American crime, a crime that goes largely unreported and unnoticed. For the next 90 minutes, we'll look at controversies involving the law, the police, and the crime of domestic violence. We'll report on a recent study conducted in Minneapolis that may have national significance, and we'll listen to the people most affected by all of this, the offenders and the victims. If domestic violence is a disturbing crime, it is in part because it represents something we seldom see. It is a crime that begins and ends at home. For that reason, some of the scenes in tonight's broadcast may disturb you. We'll start, though, by telling you the story of a St. Paul couple married for 20 years, Chuck and Melissa Switzer. We begin in the privacy of their home. A report prepared by producer Bill Hanley.
We were on our honeymoon, and we had gone to a motel, and we had had sexual intercourse, and I did not have an orgasm, and Chuck became upset and beat me for it, and that was the first time he had ever beat me. I was frightened, but after the violence, he was fine. And I had experienced violence growing up, so part of me thought, well, maybe this is the way everybody lives. I have not had any broken bones, black eyes, bruises, cuts. Once he put a belt around my neck, or his hands around my neck. Once he beat me with a belt, that kind of thing. And I always felt like, I had done something wrong, whether I had or not. And with Chuck, it was, if I had done a better job, he wouldn't have gotten angry. I realized now, that that isn't true. One time I had taken our car to have it washed, and the car wash tore the side off the cars that went through, and I thought when I brought it home, he couldn't be angry at me because that wasn't my fault, and yet I got beat up for it, and I was shocked. And then the blame was, you had no business taking it to the car wash in the first place, you know. And so there was no escape from the blame.
Do you have any idea how many times you were beaten during the course of those years?
20 years? No.
Too many times to count.
Oh my, yes.
Yeah. Every month?
Sometimes it was that often, and sometimes twice a month, and then sometimes it would go for 6, 8 months.
And you still loved him?
Yes. He's a good man. He is a very good man.
I was hiding. I didn't want to see my family. I wanted to be here in this house and enjoy the benefits of having the meals put before me and a bed to sleep in and someone to do my laundry and send me off in the morning with the blessings and the kisses, and that was the limit of my life. There are times when I just got up in the morning and came out here, and if my wife didn't have breakfast on the table for me, I was really disturbed, to say the least. I was taken care of in such a way I didn't think.
And if that wasn't done for you?
I was angry, upset, to say the least. And it would accumulate to a point in time when I would be abusive.
People who watch this television show will have probably one predominant question.
Why did I stay?
Yeah. Why did you stay?
When we started into domestic abuse project, and these women in the group were all married just a few years, and I thought, why did I stay? And as I thought about that, I came to the conclusion there are several reasons. Number one, I really love my husband. Part of my religious convictions were I did not want to ever divorce. My parents had been divorced, and I just felt insecure from that and didn't care to do that to my children. And partly, I believe the reason I stayed was I thought that was the way it was, and there wasn't anything I could do about it.
I grew up in mid-America, on the farm. When I was 9 years old, I had a pet dog. And because of the care of that dog, that was my responsibility, it resulted in a conflict between my father and I, and he took a hammer and killed the dog in front of me and my 7-year-old brother, and made us watch him as he beat the dog to death. I believe that my mother tried to kill me several times when I was a child, and I believe that when I did something wrong, that my father punished me severely by beating me with a board or making me stick my finger in a light socket or...
Your father actually did that to you?
Yes, he did.
His mother beat him up, you know, and though I've never raised a hand to him, he fears me.
I've sat at the table as a child and made a statement, just a simple 11-year-old statement, and have my dad backhand me right out of my chair. You know, so as an adult, when I say those things, I expect somebody to backhand me. Yeah. And my mother did that a lot. And when I say things to Melissa, especially if I try to disagree with her, I expect her to backhand me or to some way hurt me. And in that sense, I have been very afraid of her. In my own mind, I do not believe I ever tried to kill my wife. No.
Do you think she thinks you ever did?
I hear her saying, yes, I think he tried to kill me.
In January of last year, I brought charges against Chuck. We had been in the car going to see a friend in St. Mary's Hospital who was in for treatment, and we had gotten lost, and Chuck was confused about where to go, but he didn't ask me, and I didn't volunteer, and he got mad that I didn't tell him where to go. And so he started beating me in the car, and I tried to get out, and he took the seatbelt and restrained me from getting out. And so when we got home the next day, I went up to the police station, and they were in the process of changing shifts, and at that particular station they were rearranging their furniture, and they said it was a bad time, and could I come back? And I thought, oh, how will I ever get back here? And so I came back later, and then they took the charge. If he had not responded to the charge to be willing to go through some kind of treatment, I had come to the point that I was ready to divorce him. I had had enough if he wouldn't submit to getting help.
And I certainly don't blame her a bit for that. I mean, that makes good sense. And maybe she should have done it 18 years ago. You know, that's what my mother says to me. He's, you know, you abusive son of a bitch. Your wife should have left you the first 2 years you were married.
You think that's true?
Yeah. I didn't know I was abusive, though.
That's what I don't understand.
Yeah.
I guess that's what I don't understand.
I don't understand it either. What did you do today, Elgin?
I had a boring day.
A boring day. Did you get all your work done at school?
Not all of it, most of it.
So, how would you describe your life now?
We spend time talking together about things that upset him, whereas in the past that he would not take time to talk to me, and I would beg him to talk, and he wouldn't. And now there's no hesitancy on his part to be willing to sit down and talk. So before issues ever get to the point of possibility of becoming violent, we can deal with them rationally.
Do you worry about your kids growing up seeing this relationship?
I have worried about it a lot in the past. I've worried about passing this on. It was passed on to me. But I have to, first of all, accept the responsibility for being an abusive person. Regardless of where I came from, I am responsible now, as an adult, for that behavior. I can't blame anybody else. My children have that same responsibility.
What do you think the percentage chances are of you ever beating your wife again?
I don't have any idea. I don't have any idea. I really don't.
It could happen again.
I don't want to say that, but yes, it could. I don't want to ever say that, but yes, it could.
Chuck and Melissa Switzer, the two people you just heard speak with such remarkable honesty and courage, I think, have joined us here in our KTCA studios. Chuck, let me start by asking you to go back in time for just a moment. I know much has changed over the past year, much that's good has changed. But going back a few years, what did you feel at that moment when the breakfast wasn't right, when something went wrong? What went through your mind in that moment before you became violent?
I'm out of control. I don't have control of the situation, and I'm being ignored. I'm not being treated right. I'm not being allowed to be like I want to be. I'm not getting what I want.
Was it like a wave that really, there wasn't a point where you could say to yourself, Chuck Switzer, this is something that I should not do?
I never said that this is something that I should not do or I shouldn't feel. But yes, I did have waves of emotion that many times led me into committing a violent act against my wife.
Did you know, Melissa, that it was coming?
Yes, and I always thought I could do something to stop it, or if I had done a better job, it wouldn't have happened. I took responsibility for it.
So you felt it was something that you should somehow control if Chuck could not?
Yes, and I made every effort under the sun to control it. But of course it wasn't successful, and I wasn't aware until after I'd been in domestic abuse project and taught to what were some signs that I could be aware of that it was happening, and then it got so I could know far enough ahead of time that Chuck wasn't escalated to any serious degree that I could get away and take care of myself, whereas before I would wait till it was so close to erupting there was no escape. Even if I tried, Chuck would take the keys or lock the doors or something to keep me from going.
Mark Radersdorf and Joanne Cattell, the two people you worked with at the Domestic Abuse Project, are here as well. How typical is that both of those emotions, one out of control, one feeling he's out of control, it's my fault?
Well, for Charlie and for the men that come through our program, I think that's a very typical feeling, that to be out of control, the next step to that is, by handling that sense of out of control, is to get angry and to be abusive. I think that's one of the primary issues that we deal with the men is how to handle that sense of being out of control, and that there are other ways to handle being out of control other than getting angry and being abusive.
How do you do that? How did you change, Chuck? I mean, clearly there have been remarkable changes in your life recently. What did they say? What did you feel that changed that?
I can't really think of any one given thing. It was a whole process of things. It was just a redoing of my life. First of all, I was taught to recognize what was happening when I was feeling angry or beginning to get angry, escalated. I was taught how to recognize that. Then I was taught, they tried to show me what to do about it when it happened, like leave, go for a walk, practice relaxing exercises, which they taught me, talk about it. But ultimately, don't let things build up.
Excuse me, I think that's one of the primary factors, is that when Chuck, you said about feeling out of control, that one of the things that you talked about is that the men learn, and the women learn as well, that there is an escalation process. It's not that the men just suddenly lose it. And one of the things that I saw you do, Chuck, and you do, Melissa, is be aware of the escalation, that tension-building phase, where the signs that you talked about earlier can be recognized, and that some of the ways that you use later on, the relaxation, the taking time out, the physical exercise, talking to the group, talking to other men that you established relationships with through the Domestic Abuse Project, you were able to circumvent that.
Can people always change? Chuck and Melissa clearly have, but is change always possible?
I believe it is. It gets back to the old saying, a person can change if they want to change. Mm-hmm. And in Charlie's case, he was very motivated. He was tired of this pattern that he developed in handling his frustration. And he really sincerely wanted to change.
And it's a learned behavior. And anything that's a learned behavior, as you talked about in the tape, Charlie, about learning these behaviors from your family, and Melissa, you learning about what was expected of you in your role from not only your family, but from your religious upbringing, plays a vital role in where you were 2 years ago or a year ago. And then that behavior can be unlearned. And a lot of the work that I saw both of you do was becoming aware of new options. Like you said in the tape, you felt like you didn't have those options. Mm-hmm. And part of your work was being introduced to new options.
Does it help also to know that this is, in a sense, or can be, anybody's problem, that you were not alone, I guess, in all of this?
During all that time, I thought I was. That was one of the wonderful things about Domestic Abuse Project, was I met other women who were from good homes themselves who were having the same problem. And it was comforting to know that you weren't alone. And also there was support there to go through the process of healing. Without domestic abuse's support, and Joanna Marks in particular, We could not have done it because our friends deserted us, our church deserted us, the few neighbors that knew deserted us. It was just, they were afraid of what they were hearing, and their reaction was, I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to get involved.
And it also took, did it not, the threat of arrest
That was really a significant thing, because I knew that I needed help, and I was denying how badly I needed help. I was denying to take an active role in that, getting myself out of this mess that I was in. And that push really was a source of motivation for me to take charge of my own life and what I needed to do. But I need to add also that I must have been in the Domestic Abuse Project and related situations for several months before I really admitted to who I was. And that was a violent and an abuser of my wife and family.
And who are you now?
I am a recovering abusive person.
And we'll hope that recovery continues. Chuck, Melissa, Joanne, Mark, thanks very much. As we've already discussed, domestic violence is one crime that goes largely, often, unreported and unpunished. It is, in other words, something that you can usually get away with. Until fairly recently, in fact, domestic abuse was almost considered acceptable. The expression rule of thumb is actually derived from English common law, which allowed a man to beat his wife with a switch no thicker than his own thumb. In a sense, we're all still troubled with this very basic question. Is domestic violence a crime that demands punishment? It is a question that the Minnesota legislature will again address this session. Our next report was produced by Brendan Heenahan.
Spouse abuse has been with us for centuries, accepted by society and permitted and regulated by law. Until fairly recently, it was understood that husbands were the head of the household. Wives were to obey their husbands and deserved physical punishment if they did not. In the eyes of the law, the husband had what was called a right of chastisement. Although this child's laughter may fool you, this is the Harriet Tubman Shelter for Battered Women in Minneapolis, one of an ever-growing number of women's shelters in Minnesota. Grim evidence that despite the fact that wife-beating is no longer socially acceptable, violence in the home has not gone away, a fact that has frustrated many women's activists.
Marriage license, in many ways, has been a hitting license. We don't like to think about that, but I think the society, in many ways, gives messages that violence against women is all right. We are a frontier society. We are a society, after all, until only the recent century, where women were property. So that really all manner of violence toward family members was somehow accepted as a private matter, and that is still the case in many segments of our community. Don't interfere with the family.
My oldest sister can.
In addition to fighting hundreds of years of history, Renee Ward and others in the battered women's movement often have to contend with something far more basic: the fear of victims, the fear of being beaten, and the fear that calling the police might make matters worse. We asked one woman at Harriet Tubman what would have happened had she had her abuser arrested.
I really don't know. I think that it would just made him more angry if he just got arrested. I don't know. I think it made him a lot more angrier than when he was in jail. He's thinking he wanted to get me.
And so you'd be worried about a situation
like
that? In the hope of both reducing victims' fears and getting more arrests, women's activists helped pass state legislation in 1978, making it easier for police to make arrests in cases of domestic assaults without requiring testimony from the victims. This 1978 probable cause law also no longer made it necessary for the officer to witness the actual assault. But now, 5 years later, some women's activists complain that the 1978 law just isn't working. Police, they say, still use unwarranted discretion when deciding whether or not to make an arrest. In short, these critics believe that police in Minnesota are not adequately enforcing the 1978 law. They're just not arresting enough offenders.
I'm just saying that if the police come into the home and that violence has occurred and the woman is injured, the police do not arrest in cases where visible injury is present. They may decide to do otherwise and leave this violent man in the household. If the woman wants him removed, it doesn't mean he will be removed.
Renee Ward is not alone in her strong feelings that not enough is being done to protect battered women, and that a large part of the problem is the police. It's something we heard time and time again from leaders in the battered women's movement. So last fall, Turning Point conducted an informal poll of police officers in Minneapolis to get their feelings about domestic abuse. 142 officers, about 1/3 of the street force, responded. Some of our findings seem to substantiate the fears of women's activists. When asked if they agreed with the statement that domestic assaults are an unfortunate but normal part of family life, 22% of the responding officers said yes, more than 1 in 5. When asked if they agreed with the statement that domestic assaults shouldn't be a routine police responsibility, 20% said yes, again, 1 in 5. And maybe most surprisingly, when they were asked to identify conditions under which arrest is now allowed in cases of domestic assault, many officers seem not to understand the current law. Fully 45% of those officers who responded answered incorrectly.
We're changing the word may to shall for a probable cause arrest now.
As a result of lobbying by women's activists, a bill was introduced in the Minnesota legislature last month that would make arrest mandatory when police have evidence that a domestic assault has taken place. A number of battered women testified in favor of the bill by talking about their own experiences.
I lived in the Hopkins area. It was the Hopkins police that I dealt with, and on no such occasion was my husband arrested. I think probably between 2 and 3 times he was asked to take a walk. There were probably 5 to 8 times when there were visible bruises, scratches, marks, and there was at least 1 time when I practically begged the police officer to arrest him, and they still did not.
The key to it is that I was afraid to go for the arrest because, you know, the anger that would create in this man probably would have ended up in my being killed. That's how I felt. So if an officer can come into a situation like this, and that doesn't have to, you know, the woman doesn't have to say, or the victim doesn't have to say, I need this person arrested.
I'm here today to speak in favor of the proposed changes to the probable cause arrest law.
One of those testifying in favor of the bill 5 weeks ago was Ellen Pence, the coordinator of an ongoing domestic abuse project in Duluth, a project that includes mandatory arrest.
In the majority of the cases, it is appropriate for the police to come in and try to mediate what's going on there because there's been no assault. In a case where the police come and they can determine almost immediately that someone's been hurt or there's an injury, then their role shifts from mediating a conflict in the home to looking at a situation where crime's been committed and acting then not as social workers with a gun, but as police officers enforcing a law. So I think that that's where the police get confused, is that they don't make that distinction oftentimes of when an injury has occurred, that their role definitely does shift. So what we're trying to do is make it such a hassle to batter, you know, jail time, and there's nothing that a man hates worse than 24 weeks of counseling. I mean, I consider that a worse punishment than 90 days in jail, and so do many men. So what we're trying to do is say that every time you batter, this horrible thing's going to happen to you, and I think that that's going to have a long-term effect in reducing battering.
Love you, yeah. Love you.
As one might expect, the criticisms of police and proposed changes in the law have created quite a controversy in the police community. But Renee Ward and others remain convinced that some type of action is necessary.
Yes, and we need to help women understand that they do not have to live in a violent home, that they do not have to be objects of violence, that nothing they do should really deserve a physical beating. Nothing.
That last comment, that nothing deserves physical violence, is, I think, certainly one that we can all agree with, but it is much more difficult to figure out what should be done. Mary Pat Brigger is one of the people who have joined us here in our studio. Let me ask you, as National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, what should be done? What does deserve punishment, if you will?
Well, I think the law about assault in most cases is very clear, that when an assault has been committed, then a crime has been committed, and in that case there should be an arrest made. In cases where it's not clear whether or not an assault has been committed, we are not, and I think most people would not expect the police to come in and intervene and make an arrest in that situation. So what we're saying should be done when it's clear that there's an assault and there's all the determination of probable cause can be made, there are visible signs of injury, that external limitations need to be set on that person's behavior to show that person that they can no longer exhibit that behavior, that it's a crime.
In other words, mandatory arrest.
Mandatory arrest.
Dave Rumsa, Minneapolis Police Department, what's wrong with mandatory arrest in your view?
I don't think you can arbitrarily walk into a house and say there's a domestic situation going on that somebody has to be arrested. Each case is different. You can go to the same house weeks, months, years, and each time you're there, you do something different. I think the biggest problem that, as a police officer, I would have with that law is I don't want anything that's going to take away the discretionary powers that I have. If there's an alternative to arrest, I would like to be able to use that. I think that's probably the biggest problem or the biggest opposition that you're going to have.
I think, can I respond to that? I guess what I would like people to start thinking about is making this analogous to a burglary. If you walked into a store where the burglar was there with the gun, holding the money, would you make the determination or feel that you even had the opportunity or the option to have the discretion to make the determination that no crime has been committed, and so you don't want to arrest even though there has been a crime committed? And that's what we're trying to get to happen. When you know that a crime has been committed, when you see the results of it before your eyes, that you no longer have the discretion to decide why you should or should not arrest in this situation.
Are you also saying then in part that if you don't make that arrest for whatever reason, that in part sort of legitimizes that behavior, makes it more acceptable?
The message to the men, and we've heard, I work with the Domestic Abuse Project, you heard people before talking about that. The message to the men, and that the men have discussed this, is that when the police officer came in and they didn't arrest me, I figured, well, it must not be so bad, it must be okay. And that is the message they take from it, and that's the message we're trying to change.
If the courts hadn't prosecuted my husband, there would have been nowhere else for me to go. If the courts hadn't stood up behind what I was trying to do in having my husband charged and convicted of abuse, what other help was there available to get him into treatment?
Talking from the American Indian perspective, the women I've worked with this bill, some women will want their men to be arrested. It depends on the situations. Also within the minority community, it's harder. Within the black community, the Hispanic community, this is viewed both ways, good and bad. But most part, it may not be helpful.
Why not? What is the concern there about mandatory arrest? That it could in fact make things worse?
It could. The police department and the American Indian community relationship has not always been the best. I can see this bill being used to the abuse for the people, that they're trying to help. I can see it going in. And it also can be helpful, but I can see some officers using it against the Indian men.
Let me bring Chief LaBerge into this, formerly Chief in Hopkins. You had a policy, did you not, of though the law does not require or may not require mandatory arrest, that within your department you had that policy. How come? Did it work? What about the concerns you've heard expressed?
Yes, the policy, of course, mandates arrest where the officer does have probable cause to believe that there has been a violation of the act. On the other hand, of course, it is just a policy. It is not the law. And when an officer exercising discretion, believes that an arrest should not be made. He simply has to justify why he did not make that arrest. In other words, we're talking about some guidelines that the officer is required to work within. But if he steps outside of those guidelines, as long as he has the justification in stepping outside of those guidelines, even though those justifications may be very narrow, very limited, he still has not violated the law himself, as opposed to mandating arrest, where if the officer were to step outside of the guidelines on a mandated arrest, then he himself is violating the law.
I guess the question finally is, how much discretion should there be when somebody's beat up?
If I could answer that, the issue, there are so many issues involved here. I don't believe that we can compare burglars with domestic abusers, first of all. There's a great deal of difference. We might be able to compare alcoholics in some way, although there's a great deal of difference there too. But we learned many years ago that throwing the bounder in jail is not necessarily the answer.
But we've also heard from the Switzers, and I think we will hear more later on, that it is that threat of punishment, of apprehension, that's made a difference, that stops someone from getting hurt. And I mean, finally, isn't that what we all ought to be concerned about?
I believe that we should be concerned about that because, as you have witnessed here, it has worked, because we have here a program that Chuck was put into as a result of his arrest. There are huge, wide areas of this state where there are no programs, there are no shelters, there are no places for these people. To arrest someone, throw the individual in jail, and then a release under the Minnesota court rules doesn't in itself accomplish anything, and it's really placing the cart before the horse. If we have programs existing for those individuals that we can put those people into following an arrest, that gives the officer the tools then to move forward. And really we're talking about peace officers' biases here when we have failure to exercise discretion. And those things can be, that's a matter of education of the officer, of training of the individual officer, getting rid of those biases and letting him know that he has a place to put this person and that something will occur when he's booked. In other words, he will go into a program.
Ms. Brigger, your response to that, and then I'd like to get some views from out here in our audience.
I find myself in a difficult and funny position sitting up here, in a sense, opposing Mr. LaBerge, because our project, we have that community intervention portion of the project where we worked with Police Chief LaBerge to get the mandatory arrest policy and to get the rest of the community, the court system, the probation officers, the judges, all working together, each doing their part, so that the man did in fact feel those external limits. And I think that's important. But I also think with one step alone, the simple message from that system that's set up to be the enforcer of the sanctions of our community, and that's the law enforcement system, that they have to give that message clearly. They have to give the message that this is a crime and you can no longer do this.
Let's get a comment from the audience.
Hi, I'm Officer Mike Sarro from the Minneapolis Police Department. And in response to something that Ms. Brigger said, I don't believe that, you know, we can say every time a policeman goes on a call where there's been an assault that he has to arrest. I don't believe we can pass a law, because when we get on the scene, there's a lot of other things involved, and to limit our discretion would not be fair. I mean, sometimes the man did assault the woman, and I can't condone that in any reason, but sometimes there are extenuating circumstances for that. Maybe he was struck first and there's no mark on him and he scratched her or something minor, and just to throw him in jail because the law says so, I just can't agree with that. As officers, we use our discretion, and I believe we do a good job of using it, and I don't think we should have a law like that. Response.
From a woman's point of view, though, it gives her a moment of safety while that man is in jail to take some other steps for her own protection that she wouldn't otherwise have if he was there in the house. When Chuck was charged and we were dealing with him being out of the house, it gave me time to think and make some decisions that otherwise I couldn't have made with the stress of his being there.
I think one point that should be made is we're just the first step in the judicial chain. If the courts would back us up, give us something to work with, I don't think there's anybody here that would not arrest if somebody was hurt. I think the case here is the exception rather than the rule.
In what sense?
That he was prosecuted, he was given some help, which he needed. Putting somebody in jail doesn't necessarily, either for one night or for 36 hours or whatever, is going to solve the problem.
I think they would think twice before they would do it again because of the possibility of that happening again, that there are consequences for their negative behavior. And up until for 20 years, Chuck had no consequences for his negative behavior. Why should he ever stop? Until I said to him, the next time you do this, I will charge you. And he did stop for a period of time. And then it started again, and he dared me to charge him.
Well, see, that's the problem. People get used to the judicial system, knowing that I'll go to jail for X number of hours, I'm going to get out, and I can keep repeating this behavior, and hopefully nobody's going to get seriously hurt, but sometimes it happens, and the first people that they look at are the police because you didn't put them in jail again.
Another view out here.
My name is Imber Reichgott. I am a member of the Minnesota State Senate, and I have authored some of the domestic abuse legislation that has already passed the Senate floor. I did want to just say on the issue of mandatory arrest, we did have several police officers who testified in favor of the mandatory arrest because they felt in some ways it lifted the burden from the police officer. That, for example, in rural areas where the police officer knows the people involved and the batterer, that this allows them an opportunity to arrest the person even though it might be his friend, and therefore break the circle of violence. They can blame it on the state law. There also was the argument that it relieves the burden from the woman or the person being battered. Because sometimes what happens is that they talk to the woman and ask the woman if she wants to have that husband arrested. And I think that that is a burden that has to be taken off of the shoulders of the woman, and mandatory arrest will do that. So I think it's unfair to say that the police community is totally against mandatory arrest because that wasn't the testimony. The mandatory arrest bill...
Let me stop you just for a moment, if I will, because you've raised a number of interesting points. You talked about taking the burden off of the woman, but as we heard Penny Scheffler mention a moment ago, there are those who are worried that mandatory arrest will make things worse because they're afraid that once that abuser comes back into the family, that he will punish the woman because he was arrested.
I think the hope is that by breaking the cycle of violence, you have a much better chance of getting that person into the treatment necessary to help that person in the future. We can't just be dealing with this on a case-by-case basis and letting the person go back and back and back. We have to start doing something to break the cycle. And unless you arrest and put the person into the system, it will be impossible to do that.
Pat
Just
Brigger.
one quick response to that. I think that statement that you heard is based on the assumption that if the man is not arrested, that he wouldn't punish her, that there would be no further violence. And every study on domestic violence shows that the longer, once it starts happening, it continues, it gets more serious, and it gets more frequent unless there's intervention. Okay. So there's no backup for that.
We're going to get into that in just a moment with our next report. Before we show that, though, we should remind you that this next report does contain some graphic violence, some, not graphic violence, rather graphic language and graphic scenes that some of you may find troubling. Yesterday, preliminary results were released in an important study conducted last summer in Minneapolis. The study looked at how police respond to domestic violence, and it yielded some significant results. We spent part of last summer accompanying Minneapolis police officers on domestic violence calls that provided both the raw data of research and the raw anger of domestic abuse. When we return, we'll open up our discussion to phone calls. The number is 642-1980. But first, here's Bill Hanley's report.
I think the Minneapolis Police Department is a great department. This will be known as the Minneapolis Police Department Domestic Violence Study. We need experimentation in our profession, examination, inquiry, scientific inquiry. I think this is a good moment in the history of the Minneapolis Police Department.
Through all the backslapping and self-congratulatory comments, you could almost feel the sense of anticipation last August as Chief Boza his officers and the research organizers celebrated the end of the field phase of the Police Foundation's domestic abuse study. Anticipation because these officers had just completed work on a research study which, once the results are in, could end up having a major impact on the ways in which police all across the U.S. handle cases of domestic abuse.
Was somebody hollering over here?
Basically, the study involved about 24 Minneapolis police officers who volunteered to participate. While on duty, they would continue to handle most domestics in the normal manner. But when they arrived at the scene of a violent incident, one in which the suspect was still present, the rules would change dramatically. Instead of using their normal discretion, these officers would reach into a packet like this one, extract the sheet of paper nearest the top, and respond accordingly. The sheets told them to do one of three things: advise, meaning they should simply talk to the couple; send, meaning they should order the couple to stay away from each other for 8 hours; or arrest, meaning just that. These sheets were randomly ordered for each officer, who was to respond exactly as instructed, except in cases involving clear danger to the victim.
Now, were you and your boyfriend having some kind of an argument?
No.
Through 6 months of post-incident interviews with victims and assailants, this study offered researchers the opportunity to see how effective each of the three strategies was in deterring future assaults. For us, the study offered a rare opportunity to witness firsthand the very difficult situations faced daily by police officers answering typical domestic calls. The first thing that we noticed was that most domestics, by far, involve lots of shouting, but very little physical violence. This case was one of several we observed one night late last June.
Because my daughter's got some pills that the doctor gave her. He gave her.
Why don't you tell the man how crazy you going over being sick?
Oh man, please go on. He's just talking because he hot. But anyway, I got some pills. They're in one of the ladies at church.
Hey, are you two still?
I left my
married
purse.
now?
We married.
Yeah, but we getting it unsettled Monday because I'm gonna go talk to this judge.
Okay, what are we gonna do to settle it
Judge,
tonight?
whatever. I want him out of here tonight.
I'm not going nowhere. This is my
Because I
house,
got
just like
kids
hers.
and he's shooting dope, and I don't want him around my kids. He done shot up. They gave my daughter some pills.
Yeah.
She has spinal meningitis. They gave her enough
Baloney, man.
to last her for some seizures. She had 30 of them.
Okay, where's...
She only got 19 of them
Baloney.
now.
Yeah.
Baloney.
Yeah, baloney. The baby found a syringe over there by the wall.
Hey man, them kids.
He's
Hey
7
man, them
years
kids
old.
found syringes all outside,
No,
man.
he
They
didn't
all
find
out in
it
the back.
outside.
They all
He
there
didn't
out in
find
the
it
back.
outside.
You can go out in
He
the back
found it
yourself
in
and
the
look.
house. It wasn't out.
I think basically when they call the police, all they want is somebody to listen to them. The woman says, you know, the husband did this, did that, and he was wrong. The husband will say, no, you know, I had a couple beers after work or whatever, and, you know, am I wrong in doing that? So you have to kind of, you listen to both sides and try to come up with a compromise. Let them think that they both are right. Why don't you go over there on Monday, go down and see the judge, do whatever you're going to do. Because you're not going to get anything settled tonight.
Yeah, because this is my house just like it
But
is
Monday
hers.
I'm gonna do it. I just wanted to call the police so they have a report because I'm going downtown Monday and
Okay,
take
that's
care
fine. You know, but like I say, we're going to have to do something to settle it tonight.
Okay.
After the advising, and we find out there hasn't been a crime committed, we try to get back on the street as soon as we can, because there's just so many of those type of domestics that you've got to get in there, find out if you got a crime committed, if there's been violence, and do the best you can in a real quickie type advising situation and get back out on the street.
But all this stuff in here is mine, so if it come up missing, then y'all know who got
You
it.
call us back, we'll make a report.
Okay, because I got receipts for everything that's in here. Whatever, I don't call on him when I get locked up. When you stabbed that nigga, you was calling on God.
He always been calling on me.
This incident, according to the officers, was pretty typical of most of the domestics that they see. A lot of shouting, a lot of accusations, a lot of confusion, but no physical violence and no crime committed. This incident, therefore, fell outside the guidelines of the Police Foundation study. But several days later, another call, this one involving actual physical injury to both parties, demonstrated pretty clearly what is meant by police discretion.
Okay, what we have is we have a domestic violence act that if she hurts you or you hurt her, she could go to jail for doing that to you.
What? I don't want her to go to jail.
Okay, are you two are legally divorced now?
We got a paper. I don't want to go to jail. You see, even though she had me, but let it be so.
Okay, now, you also... What?
Yeah, I don't want to go to jail.
Why don't you sit down?
Yeah, I will sit down. I don't want to go to jail.
Okay, you also can go to jail for kicking her.
That's why I want compromise. I don't want anything, even though I got a feeling, but let it be so. You understand?
Okay.
Let it
Now,
be so.
do you both live here?
Yeah, we live here.
Okay, you're divorced though, right?
Yeah, my son there. The last of us will have to get
A
it.
decree has been issued for divorce. It's just a matter of another court appointed
Yeah,
date.
that's it, officer.
And if you're not going to fight the divorce, it doesn't make any difference because the petition's already been filed. All she has to do is show up in court with her lawyer, and the divorce will be granted, whether you show up or
Okay,
not.
that's correct. But I don't.
Now, if it's gone that far that you're going to be divorced, I don't know why you're still living here.
Okay, what went on in there, basically, and how did you handle it according to the study?
Basically, there was a fight, a domestic. The lady apparently has gotten her divorce decree. She had her husband or ex-husband to be staying with her. She was going to visit a friend. He objected to that. They ended up fighting in the courtyard. He knocked her down, kicked her in the stomach. She's 3 months pregnant, according to her. She got up and scratched his chest with
Apparently,
fingernails.
scratched her, cut him with looked like a beer opener.
And basically what we're trying to do is we got both stories, separate the two. As long as he doesn't live here permanently, he's got some friends he can stay with. We advise him to leave the house because she's got children, 3 or 4 small children. It's much easier for him to leave than it is for her.
What did your study packet? What were you operating under?
Advice.
So that was an advice situation where you simply pull one person out to whoever appeared to be the aggressor in the circumstance?
Well, in that situation, they were both the aggressor. It wasn't a question of one being an innocent victim. He attacked her, she attacked him. The main thing was to separate the two before it escalated to the point where somebody got seriously hurt.
If you weren't operating under the study, would you have handled that about the same way, or would you have thought about arresting one of them?
No, I think in that situation where they both say that they were assaulted, it's whose word do you take? In this case, we would do the same thing as long as they're divorced or in the process of getting a divorce. He has some place to go. It's much easier for him to leave than it is to take the wife and the children out of the home.
But while there are cases in which police discretion may seem logical and even helpful, there are others where arrest is clearly the officer's only recourse. One such incident occurred just before 9 p.m. on the evening of July 15th.
Police and fire emergency? Yes. This is the police? Yes. Do you want the police? Yes. They're on the line. Pardon? What do you want? Okay, what I want is a battered woman. You are a battered woman? Yes. Who assaulted you? My ex. Not my ex, but it's my fiance. All right. Did he have any weapons, or did he just use his hands? No, just use his fist. All right. He does not have any weapons? No. Are there any in the house? He's in the house, and I'm scared. Is he in the house? Yes, and I'm scared.
How long have you lived together?
10 months, and I want to press charges.
Has this happened before?
Yes, and I want to press charges now.
Yeah. Well, let's go up. You're in apartment 5? Okay, let's go up there. Where do you need to go? I've got a booking.
And I can show you the gown that was all blood all over it. All right?
Yeah. See white, black?
He's white.
What's his name again? Why did he hit you tonight?
He just got rowdy. I don't know. I only had maybe about 3 drinks. And he just got all rowdy. He started hitting me and started throwing the frying pan at me. And started throwing everything.
Does he have any weapons in there?
No, but I'll go in there and check, make sure, okay? So that you won't, officers won't get hurt, okay? Don't question the police. You won't get upset.
David? Seems to be the problem.
Flash it over here. Opposite.
Take your hands out from underneath the pillow.
Flash it over here. You'll see the frying pan that is busted.
Take your hands out from underneath the pillow.
Have a light.
They are.
Okay,
the other
hold
one.
on. I'll turn the light here.
Want to stand up?
Oh, the light don't work. It blew out. Okay, what I got over here.
Stand up.
Stand up. That's what I said. Okay. This is what I got over here. It's a frying pan. Then he threw at me.
I didn't tell him.
And I'll show you the nightgown that I have that's got full of blood on.
Did you hit her tonight, David?
No, I didn't.
How did she get the bloody nose?
I don't. Hey, I don't know, man. I've been sitting home alone here. She came home from work and she went over to her
Here, it's
neighbor's.
full of blood.
I don't know how she did that.
Let's see your hand.
Sure.
You got blood on your hands.
Yeah, that's from a scrape that was there from the beach. Man. See, there was a cut
From the
right there.
beach, huh?
There was a cut right there from the beach.
How long have you lived together, David?
Okay, that's what
10 months? How many times has this happened?
See everything that's okay. It's fine.
Twice?
And my nose is
Why don't you
very
turn around
sore
there?
and I can't
Put your hands behind your back. That looks like it's broke. Do an ambulance that go through?
Might as well go to the hospital, bro.
Or do you have a way of getting there, or do you
No, I'm walking.
Why don't you have an ambulance go out here close to, broken nose? David, you're under arrest for domestic violence. What?
Can I grab my ID?
Sure.
I can go peacefully.
Yeah, we know. Okay, go with these gentlemen, they'll take care of you. As a police officer, you're out there to protect people, and you're worried about your own safety, but mainly you worry about the people around you and what's going to happen to them, and that leaves you open, you know. And there's no set pattern that I can say how I handle a domestic, because each time you walk up to that door, it's different.
But of all the calls an officer is likely to receive, one which clearly worries many of them is the domestic involving the use of a gun. One such incident was called in to Minneapolis police by an 8-year-old girl on the evening of July 10th.
Police and fire emergency. Can you please get me the police to go back to my dad's gonna kill my mom.
What's going on?
My dad's trying to kill my mom.
What's he doing?
He's taking my mom and then pointing a gun to her. Have any squad that can check domestic? Juvenile calling in. Father is pointing a gun at the mother.
476 will go in there.
Copy 7.
I'll back them up.
1031.
You going over there? Go on. Go on. Call your mom, tell her to come out the front door. Where is he?
Right in the cherry.
Okay, I see.
What the hell? Put your hands up in the air.
Over here.
Come on out. Come on out.
Get him up in the air.
Hands up in the air. Well, really, I ain't got a goddamn thing on me. I ain't did a damn thing. What the hell's going on? What's going on? What's
Did he
going
strike
on?
you tonight?
What?
Did he strike you?
You point the gun at you? Get the fuck out of here with that camera, you asshole. Take it easy.
Cuff him.
Christ. Just what the hell's going on?
Cuff him, Dave.
Hands on your back. Hey. Jeez, my God.
No, I'll stay up here. The guns are in there. You wouldn't even get the gun.
People like you suck, you know? Just what's going on?
I don't know.
Okay.
Go ahead and get the gun.
I have no idea because I gave them to Michael and he put them away somewhere and I don't know where they are. Mike, where's the guns?
Under arrest for aggravated assault.
Oh, okay. What'd you do with the gun?
What?
Where'd you put the guns?
On the Colfax address?
Come on.
Proof 40 and 715 are going up.
You can go too.
Okay, we'll go up there and assist that Brooklyn Center cover, the one man, and we'll drop down at Colfax.
Interfering with a lawful arrest.
I don't know what's going on here.
I asked you where the guns are.
I don't know.
If I have to go and tear that house apart to find the guns, young man, you're going for interfering with a lawful arrest, which is a felony. Do you understand?
I understand.
2922 Colfax.
Now tell me where the guns are.
Let's shut this down.
You want your mother to get hurt?
Pardon?
You don't want your mother to get hurt, do you?
That's not my mother. I don't want her to get hurt.
Okay. Well, whoever it is.
Just give us the guns. That's all we want. All right?
I think the thing that has always been in the back of mind of police officers' minds since they came on is that domestics can potentially be one of the most dangerous calls you can go on. It was also an egg assault. What, did he point the gun at her?
Yeah.
Well, she's
just looking for aggravated assault.
okay. Well, let's make sure that it wasn't that he just said I was going to go get the guns. I've been on domestics where Matt has and Dave has, where you're trying to help somebody, the woman or the man, depending on who gets assaulted, or a kid in there, and you're going to take somebody out, and the whole family dumps on you. You know, they're on your back, and the fight's up. You know, potentially it's the most hazardous call you can go on.
By the time the field portion of the Police Foundation study was completed late last July, more than 340 cases were under study.
Did the officers seem like they really wanted to help?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think the officers should have been tougher on your boyfriend, easier, or did they handle it about right?
They had it just right.
Okay.
Through 6 months of follow-up interviews with victims and assailants, researchers hope to determine the relative effectiveness of arrest in deterring future cases of spouse abuse.
Let me just ask you if there are any questions at this point about the future of the study, or any comments you had about what it was like to be in a study where everybody thought they would be sued at any minute.
But last August, with the field research completed, some of the officers involved were already expressing frustration over what the results might eventually show.
You were just talking about having the police department call up families for domestics and bullshit, excuse me, and all that sort of stuff. How in the world are we going to do that when we haven't got enough manpower out there to answer calls? We haven't got enough people to put on the street in cars, you know.
Riley, one response to that would be that this is a national study. This is not just a study with implications for Minneapolis. It's a study with implications for every police department in the country.
And some of the officers also complain that, until other aspects of the criminal justice system are reformed, there will be little that police can do to help.
And there's no sense in us taking it to court, because either the husband or the wife is not going to show up, or if the husband winds up showing up because he was arrested, the wife isn't going to show. And if she does show, he's going to get back home and jump on her and bounce her off the wall again because he had to spend a couple of nights in jail.
Okay, well, we'll look at that empirically with our 341 cases. Suppose we find that Advise has the lowest level of subsequent violence, which might argue for a do-nothing strategy. Maybe Jesse Helms is right. Maybe the government should stay out of the homes of the people and let them settle their own disputes. Maybe by intervening we make things worse. We just don't know until we get the statistics back.
The statistics are in fact back now, at least the preliminary results of the study. Lawrence Sherman is with us from the Police Foundation and also the University of Maryland. Mr. Sherman, what have you found so far?
Well, I want to thank Richard Burke at the University of California, who's been working very hard to get the statistics ready for this show. We released some statistics earlier in the week that, based on the police reports, showed over a 6-month period that of the 3 treatments, the send the suspect out of the house for a cooling off period had the highest rate of repeat incidents over the 6 months, 23%. For the cases in which the police officers advised but did not arrest, they had the second highest level, or 17% repeat cases. But for those cases in which they made the arrest, they had the lowest level of subsequent violence, of only 10%. Now, we've just analyzed another set of data that Nancy Wester here in Minneapolis and her project staff gathered from interviewing the victims. And those data show something a little different. Arrest is still the lowest level of repeats over the 6-month period, but advise is the worst. That's up at 40% repeat incidents, and send is at 30%. So we're not sure at this point what's worst, whether it's advise or send them out for the cooling off period. But both ways of looking at the repeat incidents show that arrest is the most effective way of dealing with it in general, other things being equal. Now, other things aren't always equal, and that's part of the problem. This treatment can interact with all kinds of things.
But what we know so far would seem to lend some credence to the view that what we need to do is arrest more, and perhaps also to the view that the legislation currently before the state legislature ought to be supported, that we should have mandatory arrests. Chief Boza, I know you don't agree with that part of my statement.
And neither do I.
Well, I don't, because I think we're slipping between the cracks here with the semantics. I happen to believe that the study makes a lot of sense and that we ought to undertake arrests more frequently. I think it is perfectly appropriate to limit officers' discretion and to press for arrests. We're talking about mandating arrests, mindlessly requiring it in every case, not requiring women to come forward. In the Switzer case, which I watched with tremendous interest, the thing that never got said is that Mrs. Switzer had to come forward and be counted. We live in a system that has an adversarial system. And what we are trying to do is supplant this adversarial system with some kind of state intervention. We're going to make everything all right. We're going to lift the burden. I don't know whether you saw or you heard the comments made by those who were proposing the legislation. We're going to lift the burden off the police officer, and we're also going to lift the burden off the woman. In fact, that is absolutely counter to our adversarial judicial system that requires us to face the accused. And if we don't have an accuser, we don't have a case. And
Comment from the audience.
Affairs.
Comment from the audience, and we've got to get to some phone calls.
I'm wondering if the reason that there is not repeat is because these men are in prison or in the workhouse or some such place.
No, only 10% of them spent more than a week behind bars as a result of being in this project. So we can rule that out as an interpretation. Now, the real problem with trying to use this study to support mandatory arrest is that we have every reason to believe that arrest has different effects on different kinds of people. What your educational level is, whether you're employed, how long you've been married. We're just at the threshold of discovering all of those relationships. We need more research before we can begin to get at that. People have been frustrated with judges for misusing discretion, prosecutors, and their solution is to take it away. I think what we need to do is to be more sensitive about using discretion properly. What are the mitigating circumstances? If we had more research on that question and how it related to the outcomes, we might be able to guide discretion rather than just eliminate it.
Let's go ahead with a phone call.
I
Just
would
sec,
like
Mrs.
to. Okay.
Sec. Let's go to a phone call first, and then we'll get back to Janet Anderson with the response. We have a caller on the line. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Go ahead. You're on the air.
Oh, okay. First off, I don't know how much time I got, but I would like to say first off so that everybody can appreciate exactly my whole background. I grew up where my great-grandmother was strict with my mother. My mother, in turn, used to tie us up to the bed, whip us with an extension cord. There was a time I remember, let's see, on my golden birthday, on my 10th birthday, I was beat up with a stick. And another time I was beat with a 2x4.
Sir, I don't mean to interrupt too soon, but if you would please, I take it from what you've said so far that the violence in your own family as you grew up has led you perhaps to do something, and if so, what is that, and what would you like us to respond to here?
Okay, I'm getting to what you just asked and all that, but I want everybody to see the background first off. It's hard for me to talk about this. And for 10 years I lived with a girl, and we fought. And I was arrested. I was arrested quite a few times for that fact. And I came back and more or less started up again. And it was like back and forth, but then there was other times I was arrested where I had time to think about it. And I said, well, you know, this isn't what I want. Finally, after 10 years, after black eyes and you name it, I've left her because I, myself, just felt I've had enough. I couldn't live with that no more. I just had to get out.
Have you had counseling? Has anything that you've undergone other than being arrested helped you?
Okay, I've gone to a psychiatrist for 2 years. I've quit drinking. It's been over a year now that I quit drinking. I used to think that the drinking was what caused it all, until the psychiatrist brought to light that it was because of my background with watching my mother and father fight, that I thought it was right to be the dominant one as far as being a male. But my question is, it really chokes me up talking about this, but my question is, what happens when you have the female who is more or less the instigator, where, like, I take my ex, she used to tell me, well, hit me, come on, I want you to hit me. And it would lead to that, where I did. And then I was thrown in jail. I would try to explain this to police officers, but they wouldn't listen, and I was hauled away, more or less.
All right, let's stop there if we can and get a response from that. Janet Anderson, I know you wanted to speak a moment ago on a different topic, but can you also address that as someone who works in a community center, who works with family violence education? What can you say to our caller?
I think that it's well known that women are capable of violence, but I think the fact remains that in an overwhelming majority of violent relationships, it is really the violence that is perpetrated against the female, and that's just the way it is. Now, there may be more men out there who are being battered than we're aware of, because I think in this society, it is certainly much more difficult for a male to come forward and to acknowledge that he's being abused by a female. So I can accept that women can be abusive. I would say in this case, because she said that verbally, still did not absolve him from the responsibility of his own violence, and so that he is still being violent and he is still responsible for that. To get back to what I originally wanted to say is that all this evening we've heard people talk about police discretionary power, whether to arrest or not, but for the communities of color, that's really not an issue about arresting too little, but arresting too much, and unequal treatment received. And one of the real reasons that women of color do not call the police in these situations is the concern about the disrespect that may be shown them when the police do come, and then the violence that might be directed against the husband because of the view of different policemen that maybe this is a potentially violent, dangerous kind of thing. And I would guess that in our study that was conducted, and I have questions about the validity of the study, since in the report it also indicated that the policemen violated their own research design as they implemented it.
Before we go on with that,
Okay, I got a lot.
Let's get a response. Let's get a response from Chief Boza. What about those concerns? We've certainly heard them before. Is there not reason to be concerned that with any kind of mandatory situation, that people of color are going to be the one particularly arrested, particularly
In
hurt?
untidy human events, mandatory arrests are going to create problems, no doubt of it. That is not the answer. The poor, I think, suffer disproportionately from police brutality throughout the United States, and that tends to be people of color. I do not happen to believe that in Minneapolis that happens very frequently. I think that that is one of the prevailing myths, and I think that people of color have more confidence in the Minneapolis Police Department than so-called spokesmen are willing to admit, just judging from the flow of comments and complaints that we receive.
Janet Anderson, quick response, then back out here to the audience.
Okay, we work with battered women of color in our project since 1979, and overwhelmingly the response is that they do not see the police as a source for getting any kind of assistance because of the fear of how they're actually treated, and that's what we experience. Not only to speak that I am a native of this community much longer than Chief Boza, and that I have experienced it for the past 42 years. For those who didn't know.
A little xenophobia is always good for the soul.
But the real issue is that if this does occur to any degree, with it mandated, it will increase, and that police will always use discretionary powers to determine who they're going to arrest and who they're not. And they're less likely to arrest a well-educated, middle-class, white person in a nice home than they are coming into the inner city in a very negative, apprehensive mood in the first place, expecting violence to be directed against them.
Let's go to Ellen Pence from Duluth up front, then several views in the audience.
I would like to just put this law in the context of how it came about. In 1975 and 76, there were people doing police training all over the state on how to handle domestic violence calls. And the police response was, our hands are tied. We cannot arrest on these cases. So as good little women, we went out and we drafted up a piece of legislation and got it passed that gave police the authority to arrest without witnessing assault in cases where there were visible signs of injury. Then we went back out to trained police on how to use this new law that we had created for them. And what we found was that we had given police officers the authority to make arrests when they believed it was in the best interest of whoever they wanted it to be in the best interest of. And it was not based on, there were a lot of sex biases that came into how officers used it, there were a lot of race biases that came into how officers used it, and a lot of class biases in how it was used. And what we're saying now is that we've created a warrantless arrest situation on domestic violence cases, and we want the legislature to take away the possibility of police misusing it based on sex, race, and class biases. In Duluth, where it went mandatorily to an arrest situation, we found that we went from 71% of the men arrested to 89% of the men arrested were white. So there was an increase in white people arrested. There was a 10% increase in women arrested under a mandatory policy.
Let's stop there and get a viewpoint out here.
I just want to ask Mr. Sherman if unemployment was a high variable among the men that were arrested in your study?
Well, most of the men in the study were unemployed, but that didn't differ among the three treatment groups. So that if you hold constant the effects of unemployment, you still find that arrest is associated with the lowest level of repeat incidents. Yes, this was an unemployed group, but no, that didn't make any difference in the result.
Part of what I think is important about that question is that we seem to want to get the police in this instance to solve a problem which really clearly has roots that go far beyond what the police are able to solve. I mean, many problems like domestic violence have their roots in concerns that cops can't solve, right?
That's right. I think we have to be very cautious in expecting what we can do. What this study suggests is the police can make a slight difference, given the overwhelming problems of poverty and discrimination in our society.
A view from a policeman.
I would take exception to Mrs. Anderson's comment that because they're colored or people of color that they're arrested more frequently. I think there are a lot of factors that enter into this. Economic factors, number one. People that are better educated tend to call the police less in situations like this.
There is a current report out, and I do have it in the briefcase, that indicated a 1979, I believe, study that said a black person or a person of color and a white person or a non-person of color in the same circumstances was much more likely to be arrested, and they had statistics to back it up, and so they felt that the 1980 had not really changed substantially. That's a state report someplace that I read today. Unfortunately, people of color were included in this program only this morning, and we didn't have time really to get out the kind of facts that we like. One of the things I'd like to change the direction a little bit here and say that I think it is true. I think that we're asking the police to be different than the general population. And the fact is that the general population do respond differently to people of color. So we're asking them to be better than the rest of the population. I think it's unfair then to blame policemen for having the same kind of average of those who will be fair and those who won't. That's reflected in the population. But the main issue is that the study, people are trying to say, really impacts and changes people's violent behavior. And I'll contend that it may delay an episode, it may take that woman out of that immediate danger, but it cannot change what is going on in that relationship, and that you need real intervention and counseling, and that once that man is arrested, black, plain, green, whatever, color is not an issue here. When I get to what really happens to people in violent relationships, without any kind of counseling intervention, change is not really likely to occur. And with courts not consistently, once a man comes before them after an arrest, no matter how he got there, if they're not diverting them into counseling programs, and this city is not providing adequate counseling programs for them, I think that what you do is have an increased population in the jail, which is more costly than mental health services and other services to intervene.
Let me stop you there, and I don't mean to redirect things, but in the limited time we have before us, I think we must address what this is finally all about, which is which is battered people, people who are the victims of crimes. What are we going to do for them?
Officer Bender, Minneapolis Police. I agree with Ms. Anderson. I think that they should get more counseling, and I feel if you would a mandatory arrest, what we're going to have is we're going to be going in, and the minute somebody knows that they're going to be arrested for beating up their wife, we're going to start up the walk, and they're going to start taking pot shots before we get to the door. And the way I understand domestic abuse is trying to get them some counseling. And the only way you're going to do that is be able to get into the house, be able to talk to them, give them some ideals, some programs to go to. We're going to get into if they mandatory arrest, they're not going to let us into the apartment, number one, and we can't kick the door in. So what do you got? You got nothing.
All right, let me go back over here to Melissa Switzer, who wanted to respond. But again, you said that it was that threat of arrest, of apprehension, that changed your life and your husband's life so dramatically.
Yes, and I was going to address Police Chief Boza in that he said, until I made that use of the law, and yet when I hear that women are calling the police and calling them out because there's violence in their home, they have taken the guts to call in the first place, and they're looking for help. What more do you need from them?
Nothing more than that. That's exactly the point.
That's what I hear
Women
is
have got, but that's
happening.
what you don't hear from the other women, Mrs. Switzer, and that's what you're not hearing advice here. Women have got to bite the bullet and come forward and take a stand as you took a stand. What we are trying to do here is prevent that from happening.
But Chief Boza, why is the responsibility always on the victim?
Because that is the way our judicial system works. Face your accuser. It's an adversarial system.
Can I address that?
Yes, do.
In the scenario we saw on the tape here a few minutes ago, we saw a situation where both the husband and the wife, I believe there was a divorce that had just been decreed, were both injured. There were physical signs of injury on both parties. If the current bill becomes law, or had been law at the time that situation existed, the officers would have had no discretionary authority whatsoever and would have been bound by law to arrest both parties. Both of them would have gone to jail, and the children would have gone to a shelter home for children, because the officers are then responsible for those children and do not have the authority to turn them over to someone else. In that situation, nobody wins.
Comment from the back.
Yeah, I'm Denise Kamash. I work at the Domestic Abuse Project. I just wanted to comment on Chief Boza's remark about needing a victim, needing someone there to stand up. I think that women do try to do that, and there are a lot of barriers to doing that. The police are not, we don't want to lay the whole blame on them, and there certainly has been raised the issue around whether city attorneys will prosecute or whether they decline cases, whether felony cases get taken by the county attorney's office or whether they get declined from there and go down to the city attorneys and again are discounted in terms of the severity. But I also want to say that in other jurisdictions where city attorneys have taken a very strong and aggressive stance, they are able to prosecute when there is good evidence and when there is visible bruises, the police report, without the victim being there at all. And this has happened in Seattle, and they've been able to increase and go through on those cases, I think about 20 to 30%. I don't have the exact figure. So I think that that's something that that's a point to be made, that some of the onus can be taken off the victim and that the community can take charge of some of that for her.
Let me ask again, who's going to help the women? Who here is going to do something that can lessen this problem? Ms. Brigger in front.
Well, I was going to point to Sharon Vaughn in the back.
Okay,
who's
let's
been
go in back then.
Go ahead.
I'm an advocate at a shelter in the metro area. My feeling on this is that the responsibility has to be put on the man, that somebody has to say, okay, let's arrest and let's give them the choice of either sitting in jail or getting the counseling that they need. Because if they aren't given a choice, and I think that most men would take the counseling, they don't want to sit in jail. I believe this man, it has been proven, will go out and do this over and over again. If there's a divorce in the family, he's going to remarry, or he's going to have a girlfriend, and he's going to go out and he's going to be violent again. And somewhere along the line, this has to stop.
But the bill does not include any diversion into counseling. The bill merely mandates people into for arrest. And I'm not saying that arrest is not appropriate and that sometimes that is the only way to get an abuser into a program. But we have in our project 85%, about 80% of our men are not court-ordered and they are self-referred and they do come into treatment. So I think that is a fallacy here that that is the only way to get men into treatment. But
we
I
just
do
have a few
agree
moments.
there are
We just
times
have
where it's
a few
necessary.
moments. Let's go ahead with a comment in the back, please.
I work with the Minnesota Coalition for Battered Women, and I worked in a shelter for many years. And I think that the merits of the bill and the whole discussion and the reason why we're all here is about the fact that a woman, seems to me, is a lot safer on the streets than she is in her home. We're talking about a crime. It's been called a problem tonight. It's been called, it's been cloaked in the phrase the untidy human condition or situation, and what we're talking about is assault. And we're looking for consequences for that crime, and we're looking for a way to do that in the most reasonable and effective way possible. And the fact that women have no place to go, that they have no resources, that the man is told to take a walk when they call the police and they're beaten up, means that society doesn't care about them.
Chuck Switzer.
I believe that there's a lot of issues I can't address. But being a violent person, I believe that this law is absolutely essential in that this violent and abusive behavior, and men have to begin to take responsibility for themselves being violent, and that abusive behavior, the men have to take responsibility for that. And because of that, I believe that men are Class A deniers, and until they are able to confront one another with the fact that, hey, you're abusive and you better do something about it, we need this law.
Chief Boza, final comment.
Oh, I think that there ought to be a consequence. It is a crime. There ought to be arrests. I believe strongly in arrest, but we need a victim and not. How are we? Is that lady suggesting it's from Seattle that somebody who has been injured in a ski and we come in and we discover that they have injuries, the witness doesn't say anything and we're going to make an arrest and a successful prosecution absent the victim coming forward and saying that she has been assaulted? That absolutely subverts the whole concept of the American judicial system and makes no sense at all. You've got to die in order to go to heaven. You've got to take your chances and come forward.
And what about
10
the
seconds from Ms. Brigger. 10 seconds.
Your comment about you have to die to go to heaven, that's my concern. We're talking here about life and death in a lot of situations. We're talking about serious injury, and the woman being a woman in this situation being the only person who has to live with their assailant while they take them through the court system. It's dangerous.
With that, we'll have to close. Thank you all very much. We began tonight's program by giving you a number or two 90 minutes ago, a few statistics. We're going to close by leaving you with one more number. If you need help or you just need someone to talk to about domestic violence, call the metro area crisis number. That number is 227-4595, 227-4595. I'm Dave Iverson. Thank you for joining us on tonight's edition of Turning Point.
Turning Point is made possible by a major grant from the St. Paul Companies Incorporated, providing insurance and insurance-related products and services to individuals and businesses since 1853. Turning Point is a production of KTCA Channel 2.